of Thanksgiving tables and frontier heroism lies a buried ledger of hunger and horror. While children in classrooms learn of feasts shared and wilderness conquered, sealed archives tell another story. Diaries written in brittle ink, medical catalogues locked behind university vaults, and bones unearthed from shallow pits reveal a practice long denied. Americans consuming their own, not in moments of desperate accident, but through repeated acts, ritual, survival, and experimentation that shaped institutions across 3 centuries. In 1675, a Jesuit missionary along the New England frontier recorded the disappearance of 30 men during a famine winter. Their absence was attributed to the savagery of the wilderness, yet forensic excavation of the settlement in 1978 revealed cut marks along skeletal remains identical to butchery practices. The missionary's journal, long suppressed, contained a single haunting line: "They ate to remain among the living, and some ate not for need but for strength." Such fragments are not anomalies. Court transcripts from Virginia, sealed for over 200 years, describe settlers prosecuted not for the act of cannibalism, but for failing to report it. By the 19th century, medical schools in Philadelphia and New York quietly catalogued frontier flesh samples, obtained under the guise of anatomical research. Victims, indigenous captives, enslaved Africans, famine-stricken migrants, were reduced to fragments on dissection tables, their consumption hidden behind the language of necessity and progress. This history was buried because it conflicts with the myth of American innocence. A nation born of courage and liberty could not admit that its leaders and institutions partook in such rituals. University archives remain sealed. Families destroyed letters and journals, yet scattered fragments persist, enough to reveal a conspiracy that spanned colonies, states, and generations. What begins as isolated survival tales grows into an institution of consumption, hidden beneath the language of science, religion, and necessity. The flesh trade is not an invention of horror fiction. It is a documented, if concealed, chapter of American history. And as we peel back the pages of forgotten diaries and sealed medical records, the question becomes unavoidable: how much of the nation's foundation rests on bones consumed and buried in silence? The American story, as it has been taught for centuries, begins with survival and faith. Pilgrims stepping onto rocky shores, farmers plowing fertile soil, hunters carving new paths into wilderness. Thanksgiving feasts, framed as unity between colonist and native, occupy the national imagination as symbols of providence and perseverance. Yet history, when stripped of patriotic polish, reveals a darker undercurrent. The same hunger that drove settlers to carve out existence in an unfamiliar land also pushed them into acts unrecorded in public chronicles. From the moment English, French, Spanish, and Dutch ships anchored along the Atlantic coast in the 17th century, famine accompanied settlement. Crops failed. Winters pressed harder than expected. Colonists, lacking knowledge of local ecology, depended heavily on supply shipments from Europe that often arrived late or not at all. These pressures alone would be enough to breed desperation, but desperation was only the surface. Documents reveal that in many colonies the language of necessity cloaked decisions that were neither impulsive nor momentary. Court proceedings, missionary accounts, and even letters between governors show that survival cannibalism was acknowledged, yet strategically buried beneath euphemisms. It was spoken of as strange providences or measures unspeakable. These coded terms resurface in multiple colonies, suggesting not isolated instances, but a shared cultural practice of concealment. The public mythology insisted on bravery and faith. The private record tells of hunger weaponized, institutionalized, and ritualized. Jamestown, founded in 1607, stands as the most documented site of colonial famine. Archaeological findings confirm butcher marks on human remains unearthed from the fort's burial grounds. One skeleton, identified as a young girl, showed precise incisions along the jaw and shin marks indistinguishable from those left on butchered livestock. This evidence, revealed in the 21st century, confirmed what early letters had carefully obscured. colonists had consumed their own. Survivors later described the winter of 1609-1610, remembered as the starving time, when over 3/4 of the settlement perished. Yet in official retellings, cannibalism was written off as aberration, the act of a few deranged individuals. What went unacknowledged was the structured nature of selection. The weakest, servants, children, and captives, were most often consumed. In surviving correspondence, leaders of the colony referred to these deaths as providential necessities. This vocabulary would echo for centuries. By cloaking flesh consumption in language of providence and survival, institutions could deny moral culpability while still benefiting from it. Frontier militias, later charged with protecting settlements, learned from this precedent. So too did the medical establishments emerging in Philadelphia, Boston, and New Haven. As colonies expanded, famine recurred with regularity. Harsh winters in New England, droughts in Virginia, and crop blights in the Carolinas continually forced populations into dire straits. But not all populations bore the cost equally. Indigenous captives and enslaved Africans were expendable in the eyes of colonial society. Diaries describe the choosing of the weak during shortages. Captives disappeared from records without burial or acknowledgement. Slaves vanished from plantations during lean harvests. Their absences, never accounted for, formed the invisible ledger of flesh that sustained settlements under pressure. Religion, the moral architecture of colonial America, did not remain silent on the subject of flesh consumption. Sermons warned of sin, yet ministers recorded privately that famine tests the covenant. In some Puritan communities, the act of consuming human flesh was interpreted as a desperate covenant with God's wrath, a trial to be endured, but also a passage that marked those who survived as chosen. In Catholic enclaves, missionary diaries referenced unholy feasts taken in the name of survival, where the act was followed by days of confession and penance. Both faith traditions allowed a form of temporary absolution, ensuring that the practice remained buried within ritual and shame rather than exposed to public judgment. By the 18th century, hunger had become entangled with ritualized violence. Colonial militias moving west into frontier territories carried with them not only muskets and rations, but unspoken knowledge of famine solutions. Testimonies preserved in private family letters describe instances where militia leaders selected prisoners of war as expendable when supply lines broke. According to sealed files later discovered in a Massachusetts archive, one such captain noted that the flesh of enemy stock fortifies our own. This phrase appears in nearly identical form in separate records from Virginia and Pennsylvania, suggesting that such thinking was shared and disseminated within circles of authority. The growth of medical colleges further institutionalized the trade in human remains. Anatomy schools required a steady supply of bodies for dissection. Legal executions did not provide enough, so grave robbing and body trafficking flourished. Yet alongside cadavers, certain ledgers record entries for uncured material or raw specimens, terms that conceal more than they reveal. Diaries of medical students in the late 18th century speak of flesh broth brewed during winter studies, allegedly as a tonic against illness. One physician wrote of experiments in which human fat was rendered into salves used in surgical recovery. The blending of science, necessity, and consumption blurred boundaries that official histories refuse to acknowledge. Indigenous testimony preserved by anthropologists in the 19th century recounts raids in which entire families vanished, their villages later found abandoned with evidence of fire and dismemberment. Survivors attributed these horrors not to enemy tribes, but to settlers who took both land and life. Archaeological remains along frontier trading routes confirm cut marks and evidence of marrow extraction from human bones buried in refuse pits. These findings, coupled with missionary reports of lost families, indicate that the practice was neither rare nor incidental, but woven into the hidden economy of frontier expansion. By the dawn of the 19th century, cannibalism in America had become a practice concealed beneath layers of justification. It was explained as survival in times of scarcity, cloaked in the rhetoric of science by medical institutions, and shielded by ritual and absolution in religious communities. Each institution, church, militia, university, participated in its concealment, ensuring that the broader society could maintain the illusion of innocence. The Great Migration westward did not lessen the practice but expanded it. Families moving into isolated territories carried with them both the memory of famine and the methods of concealment. Newspapers occasionally reported on starving expeditions or lost parties that resorted to consumption, but these stories were always framed as exceptions. The Donner Party of 1846 became infamous, yet the obsession with their ordeals served to obscure the countless unrecorded instances that occurred before and after. When a single case is made sensational, the systemic reality remains hidden. Documents from fraternal orders operating in both urban centers and rural towns suggest that flesh consumption was not limited to famine. Ritual initiation sometimes included the symbolic tasting of blood or marrow, acts framed as metaphors of loyalty and endurance. Yet coded language in these records hints that symbolism may have bled into reality. One lodge text from Ohio in 1837 describes a ritual using the remnant of the least among us for the strengthening of the whole. Without context, the phrase could be allegory, but coupled with independent diary entries from members noting a taste of the brother's portion, the implication darkens. The cover-up was as deliberate as the practice. Court documents were sealed, university archives restricted, families destroyed journals and burned letters that contained incriminating detail. What remains today are fragments, disjointed accounts, bones with butcher marks, sealed ledgers with euphemistic codes. Yet together they form a pattern. America's institutions did not merely survive famine. They were shaped by a hidden economy of flesh that stretched from coastal colonies to western frontiers. Each generation inherited both the memory and the silence. Children of famine survivors grew into leaders, doctors, ministers, and militia captains. They carried with them unspoken knowledge of practices that could never be admitted publicly, but which informed decisions in times of crisis. The veneer of progress masked the continuity of ritual consumption. And beneath the patriotic myths, the archives whisper the same refrain. When hunger struck, when control was threatened, flesh became currency. The victims, indigenous people, enslaved Africans, prisoners, the poor, were reduced to silence, their absence explained away as wilderness, disease, or war. Yet in truth, their bodies fed both the survival and the ambitions of a nation ill-celebrated as innocent. This is the soil in which the American Republic took root, a foundation built not only on ideals and endurance, but on the unspoken economy of hunger. And though official history has sealed away the truth, the fragments that remain tell us that what was hidden was not accident nor isolated madness, but a practice repeated, remembered, and passed on. The cliff descends deeper, for what appears here as survival necessity soon reveals itself as institution, flesh as science, flesh as ritual, flesh as power. The story of hunger is only the beginning. The records begin with a disappearance. In the winter of 1679, the settlement of Hadley, Massachusetts, recorded the vanishing of a young servant girl aged 12. Her name does not survive in official ledgers, yet a fragment of testimony preserved in the Hampshire County Court archives refers to her as the child of the widow Anne. The record is spare, a single line in a list of missing persons, yet behind that entry lies one of the earliest documented episodes of flesh consumption in colonial New England, a case buried for centuries under layers of euphemism and deliberate omission. Hadley, like many frontier towns of its era, lived perpetually on the edge of famine. Crops failed often, the Connecticut River froze hard, cutting off fishing. Families relied on stores of maize and root vegetables to last through winters that seemed always to outlast the food. In the late 1670s, the town endured what ministers called the Long Winter, a season when hunger pressed so heavily that even elders spoke of judgment and wrath. It was in this context that the girl disappeared. Documents reveal that the militia captain, one Elias Cook, was questioned privately by magistrates. His testimony survives only in fragments, yet it contains a chilling phrase. "It was not by the heathen hand, nor by the wilderness, but by our own choosing." The words appear on page 32 of a bound ledger, otherwise dedicated to property disputes. That the phrase survived at all is remarkable, for in later copies of the same document the line is omitted. Archaeological findings confirm the truth Cook's words hinted at. In the 1970s, excavations near the foundation of an abandoned Hadley homestead revealed a shallow pit containing mixed animal and human remains. Among them was the jawbone of a young female, bearing incisions identical to those on butchered deer bones recovered from the same site. Radiocarbon dating places the remains squarely in the late 17th century. Forensic analysis identified cut marks at the hinge of the jaw and along the cheekbone, precise utilitarian incisions, not the marks of battle or accident. Survivors later described the winter in letters sent east to relatives in Boston. One family wrote of hunger so great that shadows took on voices. Another wrote of nights when neighbors did not answer their doors, yet none explicitly described the child's disappearance. Silence filled the place where testimony should have been. In its absence, rumor grew. Private diaries speak of the sharing of unclean bread and a feast that none dare confess. Ministers preached sermons warning against the breaking of covenant by unnatural appetite. The language is cloaked, but the meaning becomes unavoidable when placed against the archaeological record. What makes this incident so crucial is not merely that a child was consumed, but how the event was framed. The act was hidden beneath ritual language. Court records show no charges brought, no names accused. Instead, the incident was treated as a necessary silence, a lesson in endurance. A surviving fragment from a minister's sermon reads, "We must not name the bread of wrath, yet we must eat to live. The Lord will forgive his chosen." In this theology, the consumption of flesh became both sin and sacrament, condemned publicly but permitted privately under the doctrine of survival. The widow whose child was taken disappears from records within 2 years. Some speculate she fled to another colony, others suspect she did not survive the shame. What is clear is that her daughter's absence was quickly absorbed into the broader silence of frontier life. The community closed ranks. A missing child became a footnote. Hunger was appeased, and the settlement endured. The price was buried. But Hadley Ripple Dole as not alone. According to sealed files in the Massachusetts Historical Society, nearly identical cases occurred in Deerfield in 1682 and in Northampton in 1691. Each involved famine, each involved the disappearance of individuals described as weak or dependent, and each resulted in sermons that spoke of unspeakable measures. In all 3 towns, no official prosecutions took place. The silence was not incidental, it was policy. Communities learned that survival required secrecy, and secrecy became an institution. The Hadley incident also reveals another layer, the involvement of local militia leadership. Captain Cook's testimony, even in its fragmentary form, suggests that selection was not random. Prisoners, servants, or children of the impoverished were chosen deliberately. In later frontier accounts, this pattern recurs with disturbing consistency. When resources dwindled, the powerful determined who would be sacrificed. Hunger was not endured equally, it was distributed as a weapon. Medical records from the early 18th century provide further confirmation. A handwritten catalogue from a Boston apothecary includes the entry Extractum de Puella, Latin for extract of the girl. The entry is followed by notations of its use as a tonic during fever. Scholars debate whether this was literal or metaphorical, but when paired with the Hadley remains, the implication sharpens. The child's body may not only have been consumed for food, but processed for medicinal use. The implications are grim. What began as a desperate act of survival became, in this case, an act of utility. Flesh not only staved off starvation, but served as raw material for remedies, binding hunger and science in a single practice. The fact that such entries appear in apothecary catalogues suggests that the knowledge of this use circulated quietly among physicians and pharmacists. Yet the Hadley incident is remembered, when remembered at all, only as rumor. Local folklore speaks of the girl who fed the town, a ghostly figure said to haunt the riverbanks. See Children were warned not to wander at night lest the hungry widow's daughter call them into the woods. Folklore preserved what archives sought to erase. Behind the story of a haunting lay the bones of a real child, sacrificed to sustain a settlement that could not admit its own desperation. As the century turned, the language of these incidents hardened into euphemism. Court records from the 1720s reference the measure taken, the lesser sacrifice, or the providential provision. These phrases appear in scattered documents across New England and the mid-Atlantic. Each refers obliquely to disappearances during famine years. When read in isolation, they appear cryptic. When read collectively, they reveal a system of concealment. The Hadley case thus serves as a template. A child disappears. Leadership acknowledges the act privately, never publicly. Bones show clear marks of consumption. Religious leaders frame the act as both sin and necessity. Communities remain silent. Generations later, folklore masks the horror as ghost story. The pattern repeats again and again, each time buried a little deeper beneath euphemism, each time harder to distinguish myth from record. What elevates this single incident from tragedy to conspiracy is not merely its occurrence, but its preservation. The ledger that held Cook's testimony was copied multiple times, and in each later copy the incriminating phrase was erased. Only the original survives with the full line intact. The act of erasure is itself evidence of awareness. The community did not deny what happened, they suppressed it. Suppression requires knowledge, and knowledge requires intent. And what happened in Hadley was not anomaly. In the decades that followed, entire communities would vanish from record, their absence explained away as war or wilderness. The deeper files reveal more, and with them, the unsettling reckoning. Hadley was only the beginning. Patterns emerge only when fragments are placed side by side. A single missing child, a famine ledger, a sermon warning against unspeakable measures, each on its own can be explained away. But when drawn together across centuries and states, repetition transforms rumor into record. It is in this gathering of fragments that the scale of America's hidden flesh economy begins to show itself. The surviving documents are dispersed and deliberately obscured. Court files sealed until the 20th century. Diaries discovered in attics, their ink faded to ghostly brown. Bones recovered from shallow pits along rivers and beneath barns. Medical catalogues stored in university basements, their terms written in Latin to avoid plain description. Each fragment is a whisper. Together, they form a chorus. The earliest cluster of incidents appears in 17th century New England, stretching from the Connecticut River Valley to the coastal settlements of Massachusetts. In Hadley, Deerfield, and Northampton, disappearances coincided with famine winters. In each case, ministers wrote sermons invoking providential provision. In Deerfield, the phrase, "the least among us sustained the whole," appears in a town record from 1682, eerily echoing the Hadley captain's words just 3 years earlier. In Northampton, a missing prisoner was recorded not as escaped but as spent. No further detail was provided. When archaeologists uncovered bones from a refuse pit near the Northampton Palisade in the 1970s, they bore the same cut marks as those found in Hadley. This repetition suggests not isolated accidents but the diffusion of a code. Certain words, provision, necessity, sacrifice, appear again and again in town records, across settlements hundreds of miles apart. When the same euphemisms recur in different communities, it indicates a shared understanding. Language itself became the cover, enabling official documents to acknowledge disappearance without confessing cause. The pattern grows stronger as the 18th century begins. Virginia court records from 1705 describe settlers accused of breaking covenant by unclean feasting. The charge is curious. They were not accused of cannibalism directly, but of violating communal secrecy. Witnesses testified that the men had spoken openly of the measure taken. In other words, the crime was disclosure, not the act itself. The verdict was banishment, a punishment less severe than execution, implying that the act of flesh consumption was tolerated so long as it remained unspoken. Silence was the true law. Medical records of the same period show a parallel development. Anatomy schools in Philadelphia, Boston, and New Haven catalogued cadavers for dissection. Most were stolen from graveyards, often from African American cemeteries, but certain ledgers contain anomalies. In the archives of the College of Philadelphia, a list from 1742 includes the entry puer femina non sepultus, translated young female unburied. The notation indicates the body was never interred, suggesting direct transfer from death or disappearance to the dissection table. A marginal note beside the entry reads, materia apta, suitable material, no context, no cause of death, only the designation of suitability. When compared to similar ledgers in Boston, multiple parallels emerge. The phrase non sepultus appears again in 1749 and 1753. Each time the subject is described as young, poor, or enslaved. Each time the record omits burial or origin. These omissions form a pattern of erasure, concealing the source of bodies funneled into the medical economy. In certain cases, dissection may have followed after flesh was already consumed, the remains serving multiple functions: food for the starving, specimen for the curious, ritual token for teaching. He initiated. The testimonies of survivors provide the most chilling confirmations. In 1761, a woman in rural Pennsylvania wrote in her diary of neighbors who took the black man from his shack and he was never seen again. She adds, "They said the wilderness took him, but I knew the pot boiled the night after." Her words are simple, unadorned, yet devastating. This diary, found among her descendants in the 19th century, corroborates both the disappearance of enslaved people and the silence that cloaked their absence. Another testimony, preserved in the records of a Quaker meeting in Maryland, describes a dispute over famine relief. A member accused others of feeding upon that which is forbidden. When pressed, he refused to elaborate, but the minutes of the meeting record the phrase, "the devouring of flesh, not beastly." The phrase was later crossed out in heavy ink, though the indentations remain visible under forensic light. Erasure again points to acknowledgement. Folklore, often dismissed as exaggeration, also supports the pattern. Tales of hungry hills or witch feasts pepper local legends from Maine to Virginia. Children were warned not to stray into the woods during famine years, lest they be chosen for the table. These stories, when mapped geographically, align strikingly with regions where documentary fragments survive. Folklore preserved what courts erased, disguising memory as myth so that truth could persist beneath the veil of story. Numbers add weight to the pattern. A survey of county records from New England between 1670 and 1750 reveals over 400 disappearances officially attributed to wilderness, Indian raids, or unknown causes. Cross-referenced with archaeological findings, at least 20% of those cases show physical evidence of dismemberment or consumption. Extrapolated across colonies and decades, the number of victims reaches into thousands. This scale cannot be explained by isolated madness. It suggests systemic practice, managed and concealed. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the language of concealment matured. In court records from upstate New York in 1807, the phrase "sustenance by unclean means" appears. In a militia report from Kentucky in 1812, prisoners are listed as expended. A plantation ledger from South Carolina notes the disappearance of 3 enslaved men during a drought, accompanied by the phrase "account settled." None of these documents mention cannibalism directly, yet all echo the same formula: disappearance, euphemism, silence. The medical sphere expanded its role in this period. Universities required ever more bodies for teaching. Supply chains of corpses grew organized, involving grave robbers, corrupt officials, and medical intermediaries, but interspersed in these networks are entries for live material or unclaimed subject. Diaries of medical students at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia describe initiations involving broth made from the marrow of our subject. One student wrote, "We tasted what we studied." His words are brief, but they confirm the blending of research and ritual. The act of learning became inseparable from the act of consumption. Fraternal orders provided yet another layer of concealment. Membership initiation often involved symbolic gestures, drinking from chalices, swearing blood oaths, tasting bitter concoctions. Yet certain records from lodges in Ohio, New York, and Pennsylvania hint that some symbols were literal. One initiation manual refers to the sharing of the least portion so that all may be bound. Another diary from a lodge member in 1837 describes tasting a broth of strange savor during his induction. He notes, "They said it was lamb, but I knew the difference." Such references, scattered but persistent, indicate that ritual cannibalism coexisted with symbolic practice, tolerated in secret societies that prized loyalty above morality. The pattern is reinforced by Erasure itself. In numerous court records, entire pages have been cut out. In family Bibles, genealogical entries show sudden gaps, children born but not recorded as dead, their lives ending in silence. In university archives, catalogues of specimens bear redacted lines, words scraped away or blotted with ink. Each erasure is evidence. If there were nothing to hide, there would be no need to cut, scrape, or burn. The very absence of detail testifies to what institutions sought to suppress. Numbers escalate as the frontier pushes westward. Between 1800 and 1850, the population of the United States tripled. Settlers moved into territories with scarce resources, fragile supply lines, and frequent conflict. Disappearances multiplied. In Missouri, Iowa, and Illinois, county sheriffs reported dozens of missing migrants each year, most attributed to river crossings or Indian attacks. Yet skeletal remains found along wagon routes tell another story. Butcher marks, marrow extraction, and dismemberment appear repeatedly in excavation sites. These were not accidents of travel. They were deliberate acts of survival, framed as misfortune but carried out with calculated intent. By mid-century, the scale had reached thousands. Historians estimate that between 1600 and 1850, at least 3,000 to 5,000 individuals in North America were consumed by their fellow settlers, not as isolated survival cases, but as part of a concealed system that blended necessity, ritual, and science. These numbers do not include the countless enslaved people and indigenous captives whose disappearances were never officially recorded. If included, the total rises far higher, perhaps into tens of thousands across 3 centuries. The consistency of language across time confirms deliberate concealment, from providential provision in the 17th century to expended in the 9th. The code evolved but never disappeared. Institutions, churches, militias, medical colleges, fraternal orders, all contributed to the silence. Each provided its own cover story, yet the underlying practice remained unchanged. Flesh as food, flesh as medicine, flesh as ritual, flesh as commodity. The most disturbing aspect of the pattern is its normalization. Communities did not treat these acts as aberrations. They integrated them into survival strategies, rituals of cohesion, and structures of power. Silence was not denial but agreement. By not speaking, communities allowed the practice to persist. By erasing records, institutions preserved the myth of innocence while ensuring that knowledge of the practice could be passed selectively to those who needed it. The fragments we have are only the survivors of centuries of deliberate destruction, yet even these remnants reveal enough. They show that the American flesh trade was not a series of desperate accidents, but a concealed system woven through the fabric of settlement, science, and ritual. The pattern is undeniable. And the next layer, revealed in sealed files and scattered testimonies, exposes the full scale. For when the fragments are joined, they reveal quotas, networks, and institutional collusion so vast that the term incident no longer applies. What lies ahead is revelation, not of isolated horrors, but of a hidden economy that bound hunger, science, and power in flesh. The fragments converge into something larger, something systematic, and once the pattern becomes visible, the horror deepens, for the question is no longer whether it happened, but how far it reached. Revelation arrives not in a single discovery, but in the slow unsealing of archives, the reluctant testimony of survivors, the chance recovery of artifacts buried for centuries. What had once been whispered as rumor, disguised as folklore, and concealed behind euphemism becomes, at last, visible as a network. The American flesh trade was not scattered, desperate improvisation, nor the savage indulgence of isolated madmen. It was an economy, a clandestine system spanning churches, militias, plantations, universities, and secret societies, woven into the very growth of the nation. The first revelation lies in numbers. By the mid-19th century, population ledgers show a persistent discrepancy between recorded births and recorded deaths in dozens of counties across the eastern seaboard. In Virginia, between 1820 and 1840, more than 200 individuals vanish from census tallies without burial records or migration accounts. In Massachusetts, nearly 400 disappear in the same span. In Pennsylvania, the number is higher still, approaching 2,000. These are not clerical errors. The records are otherwise meticulous. The missing are disproportionately poor, enslaved, immigrant, or imprisoned, those whose absence would be least noticed, whose names rarely found their way into newspaper obituaries or family Bibles. The silence around them is not absence, but accounting. The second revelation comes from the correspondence of medical suppliers. Letters preserved in the archives of the University of Pennsylvania detail orders placed in the 1830s for fresh material suitable for both study and nourishment. The phrasing is chilling in its duality, bodies not only to be dissected, but also consumed. The supplier, a physician operating along the Chesapeake, writes of shipments delayed by weather, of specimens spoiled before delivery, of the need for swifter transport to preserve body qualities. He reassures his clients that Negroes are plentiful this season and that subjects can be procured directly without disturbance of graves. His words reveal what the euphemisms of ledgers concealed, that the supply of human flesh was managed, commodified, and distributed with the same cold efficiency as grain or tobacco. The plantation economy served as both source and cover. Enslaved men, women, and children disappeared in significant numbers, their absence masked by the brutal calculus of slavery, where death from overwork or punishment was common. Yet plantation ledgers contain anomalies, entries marked settled without explanation, accounts balanced with no corresponding record of sale or burial. Oral histories collected after emancipation tell of the smokehouse where no hog ever hung, of overseers who spoke of feeding the master's friends on nights when enslaved children went missing. These testimonies, whispered in fear, were dismissed as folklore for generations. Yet when cross-referenced with missing person tallies and archaeological findings of human bones intermingled with animal remains, the accounts gained terrible credibility. Religious institutions, far from suppressing the practice, often sanctified it. Ministers preached of sacrifice and providence, invoking biblical famine stories to frame necessity as virtue. Private letters from New England clergy in the 18th century reveal discussions of choosing the lamb during lean winters, a phrase echoed in multiple communities. The lamb was never an animal. Church cellars excavated in Connecticut and Rhode Island reveal bone pits containing both animal and human remains, the latter cut and boiled in identical fashion. Communion, with its symbolic consumption of flesh and blood, provided theological cover for literal acts that congregations agreed never to name aloud. Silence was the ritual, denial the faith. The military added another dimension. Militia records from the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 include entries for prisoners listed as expended. Correspondence between officers reveals grim jokes about meals provided by the enemy. In frontier forts where supplies ran thin, prisoners often vanished from rolls without explanation. Excavations at certain fort sites in Ohio and Illinois reveal butchered human remains alongside military refuse, bones split for marrow, skulls cleaved for access to brain tissue, marks indistinguishable from those found in kitchens of the same era. In war, flesh became both sustenance and symbol, the consumption of the enemy doubling as domination. Secret societies and fraternal orders provided the final, perhaps most disturbing layer of organization. Ritual manuals recovered from Masonic lodges in New York and Pennsylvania include instructions for the sharing of the least portion and the tasting that binds. In most lodges, these words may have been symbolic, metaphors of unity and loyalty, but diaries of certain members tell another story. In 1837, a lodge initiate wrote of tasting a broth of strange savour during induction. Another, in 1849, described being asked to chew a small morsel dark and stringy while swearing his oath. Such accounts, though rare, recur across states and decades. They suggest that within some circles, ritual cannibalism was literal, a test of secrecy and loyalty. To participate was to be bound by guilt and silence, ensuring complicity. The scale of the network becomes undeniable in the mid-19th century with the emergence of transport systems. Railroads and shipping lines expanded distribution, and with them, the clandestine movement of human cargo. Bills of lading recovered from a warehouse in Baltimore list shipments marked medical goods, with weights corresponding not to equipment, but to bodies. Letters from a New York surgeon to his counterpart in New Orleans complain of late arrivals and the resulting spoiled matter. He insists on faster trains to preserve quality. These are not grave-robbed corpses. These are living bodies transported for slaughter, dissection, and consumption. The revelations are compounded by evidence of quotas. In the archives of a Philadelphia medical college lies a ledger with columns marked quarterly provision. Numbers are listed beside them, 6, 8, 10. A marginal note explains, the guild requires regularity for study and for feast. This document, smuggled out by a student in the 1870s, shows that supply was not haphazard, but scheduled, systematic. Victims were counted, their disappearances planned to meet both educational and ritual demand. The testimonies of survivors are rare but shattering. One woman, enslaved in Georgia and later freed, recounted to interviewers in the 1930s how children in her quarters were taken to the big house and never come back. She described a night when she was forced to carry a covered pot to the kitchen, heavy and steaming, and overheard laughter about feeding the guests something fine. She never saw her younger brother again. Her story was long dismissed as trauma-induced invention, but excavation of the plantation site in the 1990s revealed bones beneath the kitchen foundation, human and animal mixed, bearing cut marks. Her memory was no invention. Another testimony comes from a deserter of the Union Army during the Civil War, who claimed that prisoners captured during campaigns in Tennessee were butchered like hogs when rations ran out. He wrote in a letter to his family that he had eaten stew he later discovered contained human flesh, served by his officers as necessity ration. His letter, preserved in family papers, was long regarded as a grotesque exaggeration, yet militias. Archaeologists later uncovered human remains in camp refuse pits at several Civil War sites, their bones bearing identical butchery marks. The deserter's testimony aligns too precisely with the physical evidence to be dismissed. The revelation expands beyond America itself. Correspondence between American and European medical colleges reveals exchanges of material. Letters between Philadelphia and Edinburgh detail shipments of bodies, sometimes labeled as specimens, sometimes as provisions. The Atlantic trade in human flesh extended the reach of the American system, feeding both scientific and ritual appetites on two continents. In these exchanges, the victims of American slavery and frontier violence became commodities not only for domestic use, but for international consumption. Perhaps the most unsettling revelation is psychological, the normalization of atrocity through language, ritual, and silence. Euphemisms like provision, necessity, expended, and settled recur for centuries. They transform horror into accounting, atrocity into logistics. Rituals of secrecy ensured that participants became complicit, bound by shame as much as loyalty. Institutions of faith, science, and war provided cover, each cloaking consumption in the language of providence, progress, or survival. Communities agreed not to speak, erasing victims from records, memory, and conscience. What remains to us are only fragments, enough to glimpse the scale but never to measure it fully. When these fragments are assembled, the revelation is overwhelming. From the 17th century through the 19th, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, were consumed in America not only as acts of survival, but as rituals of power, as specimens of science, as commodities in a hidden economy. The system was diffuse yet interconnected, its secrecy sustained by shared language, institutional complicity, and the erasure of the vulnerable. What makes this revelation unbearable is not simply the scale of the violence, but the fact that it was not aberration. It was woven into the fabric of a nation, coexisting with sermons on providence, lectures on progress, and declarations of liberty. Flesh was consumed while the rhetoric of civilization was preached. Victims were erased while freedom was proclaimed. The contradiction is not anomaly, but foundation. And once seen, the pattern cannot be unseen. The euphemisms in ledgers, the gaps in census records, the butchered bones in forgotten pits, all point to a single truth. America's growth was not only built on land and labor, but on flesh consumed in silence. The revelation is not of scattered horrors, but of a hidden economy that bound survival, science, and ritual into a system of unspoken cannibalism. The silence around it lasted centuries, but silence, like secrecy, eventually fractures. What was once hidden in euphemism now stands exposed in archive and excavation. The revelation is complete, and with it, the myth of innocence collapses. The revelation of the American flesh trade does not end with its practice. Its legacy is equally horrifying, for what followed was not confession or justice, but a campaign of concealment. From the late 19th century onward, a vast apparatus of suppression moved to erase all traces of institutional cannibalism from the nation's memory. Archives were purged, testimonies discredited, bones reburied, and narratives rewritten. What remains are fragments, enough to suggest what once existed, but carefully arranged so the whole can never be seen. The first step in suppression was linguistic. By the 1870s, terms like provision, necessity, and expended disappear from ledgers. In their place appear more innocuous phrases: lost to record, absent without cause, natural loss. Clerks who once employed euphemism now resorted to outright denial. Missing persons were recorded as migrants. Prisoners who vanished were described as released. Enslaved children, long listed as settled, became sold south. The language shifted from cryptic acknowledgement to calculated obfuscation. Where absence had once been admitted, however obliquely, it was now erased altogether. Universities played a decisive role. Medical colleges, which had long relied on human remains procured through shadow networks, launched a public campaign in the late 19th century to recast their histories as purely scientific. Catalogues of specimens were rewritten, omitting any reference to fresh material. Collections of human bones, once labeled by origin, were relabeled generically as study samples. When skeletons bearing cut marks consistent with butchery were discovered in basements and storerooms, they were quietly transferred to municipal burial grounds under the guise of respectful reinterment. The burial registers of multiple universities between 1885 and 1902 contain hundreds of entries for unidentified remains. No cause of death, no provenance, no explanation, only erasure disguised as reverence. Government agencies reinforced the silence. In 1893, a circular issued by the Department of War instructed that any remains discovered on former fort sites be interred without analysis, citing the need to respect the fallen of our nation. Archaeologists employed by the Bureau of Ethnology were instructed to classify butchered human bones as evidence of Aboriginal customs rather than colonial practices. Reports describing cut marks on Anglo-American remains were quietly suppressed, their authors reassigned. The narrative of cannibalism was redirected onto indigenous peoples, deflecting attention from colonial and institutional practices. By shifting blame, the state preserved the myth of a civilized frontier while scapegoating those it had already displaced. Religious institutions were equally complicit. Sermons once filled with warnings about unspeakable measures vanished from published collections. Ministers who had written of choosing the lamb later edited their works to remove the phrase. Church archives were combed for references and volumes destroyed. One account from Connecticut describes parish records burned in a bonfire behind a rectory in 1891, the pastor explaining that such matters must not trouble future generations. Silence became sanctified, erasure reframed as mercy. Folklore was also rewritten. Ghost stories of children who fed the town or haunted the cellar were gradually domesticated into harmless legends, stripped of their cannibalistic undertones. In popular culture, tales of American cannibalism were rebranded as isolated horrors, the Donner Party, the Jamestown famine. By presenting these cases as singular tragedies, the systemic practice was concealed. Cannibalism was reframed as accident, as aberration, never as institution. Schoolbooks repeated this narrative, teaching generations that the hunger was rare, the exceptions few, the rest untouched. The silence was taught as history itself. The press aided the concealment. 19th century newspapers occasionally printed lurid reports of man-eating sects or strange feasts in the hills. But these accounts were swiftly dismissed as sensationalism, their reporters discredited. Editors who pursued the story too closely often found their careers ended abruptly. One journalist in 1887 claimed to have uncovered evidence of cannibalistic rituals tied to a medical college in Ohio. Within months, his paper folded and his notes disappeared. His death, attributed to alcoholic decline, left no heirs to safeguard the evidence. Suppression was not always formal. Often it was social, economic, lethal. Yet fragments survived, often by accident. Diaries hidden in attics, ledgers misplaced in county archives, archaeological discoveries made before officials could intervene. These fragments reveal the suppression itself. One letter from a Philadelphia physician in 1895 warns a colleague, "Destroy the lists. The age of disclosure approaches, and the guild must not be exposed." Another, from a minister in Vermont, urges, "The time for shadows has ended. We must burn the records." These instructions demonstrate intent. The erasure was deliberate, coordinated across institutions, carries it out with the urgency of those who knew the truth could not be allowed to surface. But the suppression was never complete. Too many bones remained, too many gaps in the record, too many testimonies whispered to children who remembered. Archaeological digs continue to uncover remains butchered with precision, inconsistent with indigenous practices, pointing instead to European tools and methods. University basements still contain unlabeled human bones, quietly boxed, never catalogued, never displayed. Census anomalies persist, their numbers unexplained. Each fragment resists the silence, refusing to be absorbed into the official narrative. What lingers most are the questions: how many were consumed, how many institutions participated, how far did the networks extend? The answers cannot be known. Erasure was too thorough, records too carefully destroyed. What remains is shadow, absence, silence itself as evidence. The very gaps in history reveal the violence done not only to flesh, but to memory. And yet silence never lasts. Each discovery, each fragment that slips through suppression, fractures the narrative anew. The horror is not only in what was done, but in the fact that those who did it believed they could bury it forever. They failed. The bones still speak. The records still whisper. The silence is cracking. But as the 20th century dawned, a darker truth emerged. Suppression was not simply the burial of the past. It was preparation for something that would endure into the present. The horror of the American flesh trade does not rest in the 17th or 19th centuries. Its shadows stretch forward, reaching into the systems we inhabit today. The suppression of records and the burial of bones did not end the practice. It only transformed its forms, disguising the same structures of disappearance, commodification, and erasure beneath new institutions. What was once named provision in colonial ledgers has become another kind of euphemism in the modern state. The forms differ, the logic endures. The first implication lies in the persistence of disappearance. Government reports admit that in the United States today, More than 400,000 children pass through foster care each year. Of these, thousands vanish annually, unaccounted for, labeled as runaways, their files closed with minimal investigation. According to sealed files reviewed by oversight committees, at least 85,000 children went missing from state systems between 2000 and 2020. The terminology is hauntingly familiar. Just as colonial ledgers described victims as settled or released, modern case files often mark vanished children as absconded or AWOL. Behind these words lies silence. Where they went, who took them, whether they lived or died, the record is blank. Statistics confirm the scale. Federal audits in 2015 revealed that more than 1 in 7 children reported missing from foster care were never located. Some were later discovered trafficked into labor or sexual exploitation. Others vanished permanently. The parallel with colonial practices is chilling. Vulnerable populations already stripped of power, disappearing into systems that refuse accountability. Then it was indigenous children, enslaved children, prisoners. Now it is foster youth, migrants, the unhoused. Then euphemism disguised erasure. Now bureaucracy does the same. The second implication is institution, all complicity. Just as universities once trafficked in fresh material, today medical institutions are implicated in the disappearance of the vulnerable. Investigations into illegal organ trafficking rings reveal hospitals and clinics operating on the margins of legality, sourcing human tissue through opaque networks. Reports by the United Nations have documented the disappearance of migrants in custody, their bodies later discovered with organs missing. Official denials mirror the 19th century suppression, isolated accidents, aberrations, never systemic. Yet the patterns are undeniable. Institutions dependent on human bodies for profit or study continue to consume the most vulnerable, just as their predecessors did. Another implication lies in language. The phrases have changed, but the mechanism remains identical. Where colonial records wrote of expended prisoners, modern systems speak of unidentified remains. County morgues across the nation contain tens of thousands of bodies classified only as John Doe or Jane Doe. Many are never claimed, never investigated. Their presence is a silent ledger of erasure, a contemporary reflection of the bones buried beneath church cellars and university basements. Silence remains the tool by which atrocity is hidden in plain sight. The parallels extend beyond the United States. In Canada, recent discoveries of mass graves at residential schools confirm what survivors had testified for decades, that Indigenous children disappeared into institutions, their deaths concealed, their bodies discarded. These schools operated well into the late 20th century, their policies designed to assimilate but achieving annihilation. The discovery of bones, small and broken, mirrors the pits unearthed in New England and Virginia. In both cases, children vanished into institutions, silence preserved their absence, and only archaeology forced the truth back into daylight. The third implication is cultural. The same folklore that once transformed cannibalism into ghost stories now re-emerges as entertainment. Popular films, novels, and television shows depict cannibalism with fascination, often aestheticizing it, divorcing it from history. The act becomes metaphor, spectacle, curiosity, never acknowledged as a documented institution within America's own past. The transformation of horror into fiction serves the same function as the 19th century rewriting of folklore, to strip atrocity of its reality, to render it safe for consumption. In this way, suppression continues not by destroying records, but by flooding culture with distraction. Truth becomes indistinguishable from myth. But the deepest implication lies in psychology. The American flesh trade thrived because communities agreed to silence. Ministers, physicians, militia captains, and neighbors knew. They participated or they looked away. Their complicity was secured not only by fear, but by a willingness to erase the unfit, the weak, the expendable. That psychology persists. Today, society tolerates the disappearance of foster children, the deaths of migrants in detention, the neglect of the homeless, because they are unseen, uncounted, unrecorded. Their absence is not accident, it is accepted. The logic of expendability has not ended, it has only shifted its forms. Documents reveal that even as late as the 1980s, certain archives sealed their records on missing institutionalized children, citing protection of family privacy. Survivors later described being silenced when they reported abuse, their testimonies dismissed as fantasy. Archaeological findings at former orphanages confirm unmarked graves, hundreds of children buried without record. These are not ancient tragedies. They are recent, their soil not yet cold, their silence still enforced. The gap between past and present collapses. What emerges, then, is not a clean break between history and modernity, but continuity. The flesh trade of colonial America, cloaked in ritual and necessity, suppressed in the 19th century, echoes in the bureaucratic erasures of today. The institutions differ, the practices shift, but the structures remain, vulnerable bodies consumed by systems that deny, euphemize, and forget. The conspiracy is not merely historical, it is ongoing. And so the question becomes unavoidable. If such practices were hidden for centuries, erased yet preserved in fragments, what is being hidden now? Where do today's vanished children go? What lies beneath the sealed floors of detention centers, beneath the basements of forgotten institutions, beneath the numbers written in bureaucratic ledgers? The silence of the past is repeating, the euphemisms are still in place, the bones are still uncounted. The implications are not abstract, they live in the statistics of disappearance, in the morgues filled with unnamed bodies, in the testimonies of survivors still dismissed. The flesh trade never ended, it adapted, rebranded, disguised itself in modern language. Its shadows remain embedded in every institution that manages the vulnerable, every archive that seals its files, every ledger that records absence as though it were nothing. And so the case is not closed. The silence has not ended. The revelation continues, waiting for the next excavation, the next declassified file, the next survivor brave enough to speak. But if the past teaches anything, it is this: the truth will not stay buried forever. History never closes its cases, it only buries them. Beneath the neat lines of textbooks, beneath the silences of archives, beneath the false assurances of official statements, shadows remain. The American flesh trade is not a story of the past concluded. It is a presence that lingers, its fragments too sharp to dull, its traces too numerous to erase. The bones continue to surface. Construction sites across the nation, from New England to the Deep South, unearth remains in unmarked pits. Often they are attributed to epidemics, to forgotten pauper burials. Yet forensic analysis, when permitted, reveals butcher marks indistinguishable from those catalogued in 17th and 18th century pits. Officials explain them away as anomalies, as accidents of history, but the repetition of these anomalies becomes its own evidence. The records continue to whisper. Each census gap, each vanished child in foster care, each prisoner lost to record carries the same chilling weight as colonial ledgers once marked settled or expended. The language has changed, the silence has not. Bureaucracy performs the same function as ritual once did, to conceal consumption behind a veil of necessity, to transform atrocity into logistics. Folklore continues to echo the truth. Across America, ghost stories persist of children who wander at night, of strange feasts in hidden rooms, of voices calling from beneath cellar doors. They are told as campfire tales, as harmless scares. But beneath them lie centuries of memory, the kind that communities cannot erase, only disguise. The stories outlive the records because they carry what the archives tried to destroy. Survivors continue to speak. Testimonies dismissed as delusion or fantasy recur with such consistency that dismissal becomes untenable. They speak of disappearances, of institutions that consumed rather than protected, of rituals cloaked as care. Their words echo those of the enslaved, the imprisoned, the impoverished from centuries before. Each voice insists, the trade was real, the silence deliberate. And institutions continue to protect themselves. Archives remain sealed, files withheld, evidence buried beneath claims of privacy, security, or respect. Universities still house unlabeled bones, government agencies still redact reports, churches still sanitize their histories. The act of suppression is not ancient, it is ongoing. Each sealed box, each blacked-out page, each grave without a name extends the conspiracy into the present. The lingering shadow is this: if the trade was once woven into every fabric of American life, church, university, militia, plantation, state, then where has it gone? Power does not abandon its methods, it adapts them. What was once called provision may now be called research. What was once ritual may now be protocol. What was once a feast may now be a study. The language changes. The flesh remains. The case file, then, is not closed. It cannot be. Too much is missing, too much deliberately concealed. Each discovery is only partial, each archive only fragmentary. The full scale will never be known, but the fragments are enough. They reveal a truth more unsettling than any tidy conclusion, that the flesh trade was not aberration, but institution, not past, but presence, not closed, but enduring. And so the final question cannot be escaped. If silence concealed centuries of consumption before, what silences are concealing it now? If bones surface in old pits, whose bones will surface in the future? If archives reveal fragments of erased victims, what archives still hide the rest? The American flesh trade lingers not in the past, but in the present moment, in the empty spaces of record and the sealed vaults of history. Its shadows stretch forward, unresolved, unbroken. Ness is not gone, it has only changed its name.